U.S. protectionism is hurting Canadian businesses, according to Canadian businesses, and we wonder if there is anything more you feel you can or that you should do about that. And Mr. Prime Minister, your views at this stage now that we've seen Buy American play itself out.
The Buy American provisions that were there, as I noted at the time, we made sure that they were WTO compliant. That doesn't mean that they're not a source of irritation between the United States and Canada. Prime Minister Harper, I want to emphasize, has brought this up with me every single time we've met, so he's been on the job on this issue, and our teams have been working together. It appears that there may be ways to deal with this bilaterally, but also potentially multilaterally. The provincial governments in Canada, my understanding is, are not signatories to the WTO government procurement agreements that would have preempted any of these Buy America agreements. That might be one solution, but in addition, we're pursuing on a bilateral track efforts to make sure that these sources of tension diminish. But I do want to keep things in perspective. U.S.-Canadian trade continues to be robust. Canada continues to be a huge trading partner to the United States. Businesses in the United States and Canada both benefit from that trade, as do consumers. There is no prospect of any budding trade wars between our two countries. These are legitimate issues that have to be raised, but I think it's important to understand that on the scale of our overall trading relationship, these aren't these shouldn't be considered the dominant element of our economic relationship.
As you know, I agree with the President's assessment. We shouldn't lose the forest for the trees. These are important irritants. They are having some real impacts, but they are, relatively small compared to the overall scale of Canadian-American trade. But I would emphasize that it is critical at a time where we're trying to see a recovery in the global economy, where forces of protectionism are a very significant threat, that we continue to demonstrate to the world that Canada and the United States can manage trade relations in a way that's extremely positive and a model for other countries.
Aside from your meetings with the Obama administration this week, you also met with congressional leaders. If you could mind sharing us a little bit more about those discussions, those meetings, and whether you saw some hope for addressing some of these issues involving the border, and whether the border came up in those discussions.
We did talk with leaders of Congress about border issues, obviously about some of the trade issues. We're looking to see if there's a way. Obviously, we've been hit in particular by the Buy America provisions, but the important thing to note is, it isn't Canada that's been hit by the Buy America provisions. As I indicated or said to leaders of Congress, we not only have the largest trading relationship in history, but it's important to understand that a third of that trade occurs within companies. Another third of that trade occurs within the supply chain of a product. So this is not a case of massive trade going back and forth. This is a case of the actual deep integration of two economies that are in fact one economy. And so when you start doing domestic procurement preferences that may affect a Canadian company, they are almost certainly affecting an American company on the other side of the border. All of this is detrimental. Whether I agree with it or not, we concede that the purpose of the Buy America provisions in the stimulus package was a concern about jobs. But what we know is, as this affects Canada and U.S. border commerce, this is not job creating. This is job destroying on both sides of the border. We're working with the American administration on how we can deal with that. We've got a proposal before Secretary Kirk. We're optimistic that we can find some non-legislative resolutions in that, and I would hope and certainly got a sense from my discussions with congressional leaders today that Canada is not the target of any of this, and there's any way we can resolve this without impacting maybe the concerns that actually led to it. I think we'd all be happy to get this resolved.
So it's a little bit like question period. And my specific question is, you've talked a lot about the strength of the Canadian system, but with the upcoming G20 meetings, what specific steps should the international community take? What should Canada be telling people to do specifically so that we don't go through another significant worldwide financial crisis, and so that does not happen again and have an impact on Canada and other countries?
Right. Well, first of all, I just have to correct you. If this was question period, you wouldn't quite do it that way. You would begin by insulting me for 15 to 20 seconds, and you would never get to your question. If I can say this, the most important thing we have to do, I listed the steps we're taking. We obviously have to fix the financial sector, truly fix that, and put the kind of regulatory framework in place domestically, as I say, with some international peer review, to make sure that doesn't all happen again. But I'm going to say this, and this is more important than any particular action. There has to be a shift in mentality here. We are now in a global economy, and we do have to think globally about our economy. I'm not just talking about the United States, all the big players. We all have to understand that, we know this from our own historical experience in our countries. We know that a dynamic market economy does require governance. We went through periods in our history where we had very little governance over the economy. We know what we saw. We saw the kind of wild fluctuations we've seen in the last few years. We cannot go on like this. Something will happen very bad. Now, we're not going to create a world government, but we do have to have the countries of the world come together and look at global problems together and look at the global economy as a system. We have to start to look at things not just from our national interest, but from certainly a more enlightened view of our national interests that understands that if we don't think globally and think about global solutions, if we all simply work on national solutions, we're going to continue to have these kinds of problems. So I think that's the biggest shift. I can't say for sure whether it's happening. I know it needs to happen. So it isn't just a question of better financial regulation. We have to have systems of financial regulation that we all can have confidence in not just our own, but in one another's. We've got to have approaches to trade that don't just keep borders open, but ensure that we have things like flexible exchange rates that prevent unsustainable imbalances from growing in our economies, in our global economy. So I think that's the biggest single thing. We've got to have a shift, particularly from the major players, towards a systemic view of global economic management, not simply national interests writ very narrowly.